But they try to say, well, a fetus is not a person. The genetic existence of a human may begin at conception, but it is not a person yet. But to do this would just be to make up an ad hoc definition. It is not relying on a scientific foundation or evidence. It is just an ad hoc attempt to define what you want to be a person and not a person. And this doesn't prove anything.
No. As demonstrated in my previous video, that's just a lie and a little more. Personhood has been the contention of medical science and ethics, and this discussion covers numerous key stages of development, not just the one you are talking about. To recap from my previous video, the four most frequently discussed are conception, neuromaturation, so development of the central nervous system, neonatal perception, so the development of consciousness, and fetal viability. These are all discussed in medical ethics. Once we expose a lie to a straw man, we see that all you are doing is asserting that only the initial fertilization matters and no other stage of development exists. I even came to you in person and talked to you about this, and you just kept on lying, stating, I can define an embryo, therefore I'm right. My position is special and above yours somehow or another. You didn't actually defend it, you just kept restating that you had the scientific basis on the definition of an embryo when no, that's not how argument works. As noted, your definition fails to account for the fact that over half of all fertilized embryos fail to implant, supposedly by your God's design, according to your scripture. And yet no Christian sees these fertilized embryos as actually being a child. They only see it as a child if they can use that argument to control another person, to enslave them, to turn them into a birthing vat, a physical object you can use and abuse. That's the only time you give a crap. Also note how, unlike you, I'm not claiming that your position or this earlier period doesn't exist. I'm arguing against it on the basis of ethics when compared to other points of development. However, above all of these, I still forward that even if it were a person, this would not give you the right to enslave another human being. So it's really a mental exercise more than anything else.
And this philosophical view can lead to very devastating consequences. One only needs to open a history book and see what happened the last time a group of people decided another group of people were not actually people and not worthy of life and liberty. When you just decide you get to define what is a person and what isn't, without a scientific or ethical foundation, you will open the door to some pretty terrible possibilities. That should be obvious. We don't get to simply just define what a person is based on how we feel.
Great, so you don't get to redefine a person with a womb as a birthing vat with no human rights without scientific basis. So please, present the scientific basis as a reminder. All you did in the first half of the video was define an embryo. Show us how a human being with a functioning womb isn't a human, doesn't deserve their human rights. Also, it's amazing how you used slavery as the analogy when you are forwarding literal slavery. Not figurative slavery, not analogous to slavery, actual fucking slavery. Now you may claim that it's okay to force a person to carry out gestation and labour with medical risks to themselves against their will because it benefits what you claim is another person. Okay, well, doesn't slavery always benefit another person? Like, slaves aren't working for their own good. If they were, then they wouldn't be slaves, they would just be working. People with functioning wombs are not your property to abuse on the basis of the definition of an embryo. I'm sorry if that upsets you, but that's the ethical standard of human rights.
I propose an objective standard to decide this, and the only standard rational individuals can agree on would be science. And science is pretty obvious on what constitutes as human life. Of course, the pro-abortion crowd will usually just throw out some ad hoc reason a fetus is not a person, without realizing the implications that would follow if they were right, as well as do it without a good reason for accepting their conclusions. For example, some will say a fetus is not a person because it has to depend on the mother for life. Well, there are also certain people that are only alive because they are on life support. Does that mean they lose their personhood when they need to depend on something else for existence? And nothing in science or ethics says personhood changes if someone has to depend on someone else for their existence. Where's that written down?
No. But it's irrelevant since there's a big difference between being hooked up to a machine and being hooked up to a human being. Even if a fetus were a person, that would not give them the right to demand that another human being be enslaved for their survival. We abolished slavery. Deal with it. The relevance of viability, however, is that once a fetus is viable, It's not an abortion, it's a birth. All an abortion is separating a fetus from the host person. That's it.
Some say because the fetus is not conscious yet, it is not a person. And how do they know this? Because they do not have the experience or knowledge of you or me? Lack of knowledge doesn't mean someone is not a person. People in vegetative states have very low IQs, and no one says they are not persons. What about people in deep sleep? Do they cease to be persons just because they do not display signs of consciousness, then suddenly become persons when they wake up? In consciousness, it's much harder to define, and we have good evidence it is fundamental and not a later developed process.
Which is total bullshit. Remember the two middle points I mentioned, so neuromaturation and neonatal perception? Well, they deal with not just consciousness as with neonatal perception, but the very growth of the systems in place for neonatal perception, so the central nervous system. A fetus only starts to develop thalamocortical fibers necessary for pain perception at around 23 weeks and won't finish developing them to a degree that allows for perception for even basic stimuli such as pain for another 6 or 7 weeks. Likewise, the cerebral cortex develops around that time and begins producing EEG waves, a lack of said waves being used to declare brain death. This places them well beyond the 24-week cutoff period in the UK. As for the US, cutoff periods vary state to state, yet almost all abortions are performed before the end of the first trimester at 12 weeks, so well and truly within said limit.
So for instance, let's suppose we define a person to be someone who is capable of intentional action. Well, guess what? Science is not on the side of abortion advocates in this case either.
I don't know why this is relevant, since I've never seen that definition forwarded by anyone other than yourself, and you don't list any pro-human rights sources either. This makes it seem like you're simply making another straw man. Don't you ever get tired of being dishonest? Like, I couldn't even imagine having to lie like this every single day for the rest of my life. How do you cope?
Even though consciousness in fetuses is very hard to study, by 14 weeks of age, there is undeniable evidence that fetuses display intentions, and by definition, would be persons. So for instance, studies have found that fetuses have goal-directed intentional actions. Abortion advocates often counter by denying the science and claiming that these movements are not conscious, but are just reflexes, sort of like when one's knee is struck with a reflex hammer. But once again, the science is not on their side. In a 2010 study published in the journal of PLOS Medicine, researchers analyzed the movement patterns of 14 old-week fetuses to determine whether they reached for their face, for their eyes, or towards their twin. They displayed a pattern consistent with intentional movement. The researchers found that the movement of the fetuses did have a phase of deceleration, which means they slowed their hands down incrementally as they reached their goal. When humans reach for an object, their hand has to decelerate as they reach out. For instance, when you reach for your eyes, if your hands do not decelerate, you could damage your eyes if your hand makes contact at full speed. The same conscious behavior was seen in fetuses.
Well, there are a number of issues with what you state in this segment. First of all, it's study, not studies as you pretended. I had a hard enough time finding anything vaguely similar to this study, but more on that in a second. Secondly, said study is not at all indisputable, let alone undeniable. The study of 5 pairs of twins looked at the number of movements and measured the time they took and the length of the deceleration period, so the time after peak speed. And yes, they found a statistically significant difference. The problem, however, is that I can't find any evidence that they accounted for extraneous variables, i.e. things they're not supposed to be measuring. Most twins, both monozygotic and dizygotic, so identical and non-identical respectively, are diamniotic. That is, they have separate amniotic sacs. Now, how having 2 separate volumes of liquid pressing against each other affects deceleration is an interesting question, especially with movements across such a small space. Then we have the facts that the directions of the movements were different. Movements were only measured when the fetus being observed was facing the back of its twin. The problem is that the motions up towards the fetus's own face, out towards the back and the back of the head of the other fetus, and sideways towards the uteri wall each have different motion patterns moving different muscles. Therefore, the differences at this point could be the result of differences in the muscles used and how they developed by this point. Thing is, all of this is conjecture, a sad result of a study that's not exactly clear in why it made the conclusion it did, and since no follow-up study has been conducted to investigate things further beyond the 5 pairs of twins used, I don't have a lot to work with. Again, I'm not saying this to tear down inspiring philosophy, since my first video achieved that on its own, because all of this is irrelevant to bodily autonomy. That's another reason I kept my first video separate to this one, because it was more than just about length. It was about keeping the upholding of a person's innate human rights separate from red herrings like these ones. I'm critiquing this study and the way inspiring philosophy has used it because it's so poorly written and downright questionable in whether it accounted for the extraneous variables that I spent ages looking for a follow-up study to shed further light on things, and came up empty-handed. The closest I could find was a study which looked at fetal development of 15 fetuses between 24 and 32 weeks of pregnancy, which showed that during this time the fetus developed anticipation of its own motions. So by week 32, a fetus would open its mouth before its hand reached the area, unlike prior 24 weeks, where its mouth would only sometimes open in response to the direct stimuli of the hand touching said mouth. Meaning that the fetus had become aware of its own movements to some degree by 32 weeks. But since this comes after the 24-week period, I don't know what relevance this is. But without a follow-up study of the one you referenced, I'm going to have to question the foundation of its conclusions.
Furthermore, other authors have found that detailed observational studies of fetal behavior using real-time ultrasonography also demonstrate an exploratory sensation testing nature of fetal action from as early as 10 weeks gestational age. At this stage of development, some areas of the body are innervated with sensory nerve fibers and others are not. Those that are innervated, such as the lips, cheeks, ears, and parietal bone, are frequently touched by the hands, the fingers of which are themselves richly innervated. Fetuses have been observed exploring the boundaries of the innervated and uninnervated regions, particularly at the anterior fontanelle of the forehead, where innervation ceases. As the nervous innervation of the forehead increases and the boundary migrates during development, so the fetus's exploration of this region migrates with the boundary. So even if we think science can determine whether someone is a person, and persons are defined as agents capable of intentional actions, then our best scientific evidence shows that first trimester fetuses are persons.
Inspiring Philosophy, you've been displaying the wrong book on screen. The book on screen is the 2015 edition about the last 15 weeks of gestation. You wanted the 2010 book on the first 25 weeks. As for what it states, the fetus responds to some form of stimuli. Okay, this makes for intention. How? We can make clay protocells stop when they come into contact with a fuel source. That is stimuli. Does that mean that there is a conscious intent to find said fuel or merely a response? If so, then we've not only shown abiogenesis, but actual development of consciousness. But joking aside, again, pretty irrelevant, and until you demonstrate otherwise, that's all this book will be. How does this show us that a human being does not have the right to bodily autonomy and you can enslave them, abuse them, etc.? It doesn't, any more than the definition of an embryo.
Plus, all of this is just arbitrary attempts to define a person anyway. Nothing about it is scientific or logical. So why should we take the abortion crowd seriously when this is the best they can do?
Now, if you were at all intellectually honest and not simply projecting in every direction, perhaps you'd ask yourself the same question. And I get what's coming. You're going to reaffirm the lie that you have some scientific standard because you have some definitions of an embryo, a single questionably relevant study, and a totally irrelevant quote from a book. You're going to pretend like this is all the science out there whilst you ignore actual science investigating the central nervous system and EEG waves, because you're not here to seek truth. You're here to sell lies to justify stripping real people of their human rights. So just get on with it. Go ahead and make your assertions without any basis whatsoever.
And all the science is on our side. My favorite argument the pro-abortion crowd tries is to say an abortion is not immoral because it is currently legal. This is just utterly ridiculous. Governments are not perfect judges of morality, and trying to appeal to them as a just decider of morality really shows they are not thinking at all. If they really believe something is okay, just because the government says so, then I expect them to agree with everything the government does from now on. But we all know they don't, and they are only appealing to governmental laws because it suits them, not because they actually think legality makes something moral.
I've never actually seen this argument made by a pro-choice advocate, since they're more often talking about the before-mentioned science as well as the far more important fact that inspiring philosophy is forwarding slavery of a human being for the benefit of a non-human. Maybe inspiring philosophy has met people making this argument, but due to the sheer number of strawmen he's constructed throughout his video, I find it more than likely that this is just another such poorly made caricature.
Another silly argument is when you are asked, what if you were in a burning building and you only had the chance to save a crying infant or 100 fertilized eggs? If you choose the baby, then you must really not think eggs are human life. Yeah, because high-strung situations where you're in a panic for your life are the best situations to make rational decisions about what is life and what isn't. Just because most people would grab the baby in that situation, that doesn't mean the fertilized eggs are not human lives. Quick emotional decisions in terrifying situations are no way to judge what is a scientific fact about the beginning of life.
Inspiring philosophy, I don't know if you knew this, but when you ask that question, you're not actually inside a burning building. Your excuse is just that, a bollocks excuse and an admission that you know you're full of shit, but will do everything you can to find a way of denying that. That's the real trick of the argument. It proves you to be a two-faced weasel wanting nothing more than to abuse other people for a decision that you have no right to be involved with. That's all.
So the fact remains, life begins at conception, and nothing the pro-abortion community can offer provides any reason that this unborn child doesn't have a right to life like the rest of us. These appeals to emotion do nothing to address the science on the issue. Abortions should only be used as a last resort in extreme situations, when the life and health of the mother is threatened. Most people in the pro-life community recognize an abortion may be a necessary procedure to save the life of the mother if there are serious complications. It is not a necessary evil we want, but once we remember Thomas Aquinas' doctrine of double effect, we can remember sometimes choices like this must be made. The doctrine of double effect is simply an action you think you ought to do that will have a good and bad effect, hence a double effect. In the case of an abortion, where the life of the mother is at stake, we are not intentionally trying to end the life of the child. We are trying to save the mother, but it creates a double effect. One effect being something we do not want, but it is necessary to also bring about the good, which is saving the life of the mother. So ethical dilemmas like this can be avoided with the doctrine of double effect. To wrap up, I want to emphasize I'm not condemning anyone who has had an abortion without the knowledge of what they are doing. The intention is only to attack people who say it is okay to have an abortion, if the mother just feels like it. There is something seriously wrong with that line of thinking, as all the science demonstrates a fetus is a human life. And notice that although I am a Christian, I didn't argue from the Bible or any other religious text, despite pro-abortion advocates claiming that is how we argue. If anyone says the only argument used to support pro-life ideas are biblical, then they are only showing they have never really taken the time to actually study our arguments, despite calling themselves reasonable scientists who investigate everything.
Well, the reality is that your quote, non-religious arguments are simply a newly formed aspect to your religion being entirely faith-based with only minor pretenses of being either scientific or ethical. You brought forward science as much as Ken Ham and the Creation Research Institute bring forward science on evolution. That's to say, you don't. Hell, you even forwarded the mystical and unproven magic of a soul as a reason against abortion at 8 minutes 27 seconds in, and since a soul falls well under the realms of religion being a supernatural belief, you are actively lying. Simply adding further lies to your religious doctrine does not make said religious doctrine non-religious. There is not a smidge of scientific basis for anything you have forwarded. You've given us some definitions of an embryo, which is not an argument, an irrelevant study, and a relevant quote from a book. Well done. All this actually amounts to is your massive incredulity and projection.
One last thing. A common lie is we need to allow women to have abortions because having the choice helps a woman's mental health and well-being. Well, this is false. and studies in Finland that looked at the medical literature pointed out suicide rates increased 6-fold for women who have had an abortion. Abortions not only murder an innocent life, they lead to depression and suicidal tendencies in women. It is time we move past this barbaric practice and stand up for the life of the unborn child and the mental health of women everywhere.
Then go ahead, do the right thing, and delete your video full of nothing but abusive lies. My very first point in my first video was that almost all women who received an abortion felt it was the right thing to do, whilst those who had regret thanks to the abuses launched by people such as yourself. It's the same as we see with anti-LGBT+ rhetoric, where InspiringPhilosophy and his buddies abuse said communities and then use the measurable effects of said abuse to justify their abuse. It's circular. The fact is this. Several key in-depth analysis by both the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges and the American Psychological Association, which took into account various variables including prior mental health problems and social background, found the argument you are forwarding to be little more than an opportunistic lie. One of the things the studies note about dishonest people such as yourself is that you ignore the chemical shift caused by both abortion and birth. Postnatal depression. I guess that means we should just make pregnancy illegal. Thing is, you know this. That's why, rather than using the most in-depth studies for both the UK and the US, you had to restrict yourself to studies from Finland, which even state in their conclusions that, quote, the causes for the increased suicide risk, including mental health prior to pregnancy and the social circumstances, should be investigated further, end quote. So the Finland study you decided to quote doesn't even say that the suicide is the result of an abortion itself. Yet that further research needs to look at both pre-existing mental health issues and social circumstances. Now, as already mentioned, we have studies that have done just that, and they're publicly available. They've always been publicly available. They were well known when you made your video, and yet you have to actively pretend that they don't exist as they refute your claims in their entirety. Note that the first study you showed on screen was just an initial paper by the same lead author, using some of the same evidence. They merely updated their analysis in the follow-up paper since they'd gathered more data. So in truth, you have one study from Finland at two different stages. The myth that abortion causes greater levels of depression and suicide than, say, birth due to the abortion itself is nothing more than a myth that needs to die. You titled your video, Science Against Abortion. But from the evidence presented here, we can see that there's nothing scientific about it, period. Simply defining an embryo using a random study, quoting an irrelevant book, and then using a further 2 studies to lie about the status of women who seek abortions is not an argument. Learn to live with that fact and get over it. Hi there. I just want to say a few things here at the end of the video before you go. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's ever donated to the channel via Patreon, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, John Schoenrock, Alexander Williams, and Daniel Martinez. Your support has ensured this channel its ability to grow over the years, and for that we are truly thankful. I'd also like to ask that you comment down below and like this video, as well as subscribe and follow Essence Thought on Facebook and Twitter. Please also consider following Atheist Alliance International on Facebook, an organisation dedicated to helping atheists around the globe. Do note, any comments utilising language which insults others on the basis of perceived gender, sexuality, ethnicity or ability, both mental and physical, will be removed immediately and the commenter may be blocked on the moderator's discretion. Let's keep this space one which upholds the humanist values. Thank you for watching.